Good afternoon, or should I say good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters who are watching us right now. We've gone live right now, and I am Daoud, the Executive Director of CAIR Michigan, also a member of the Imams Council here in the state of Michigan, as well as a senior fellow at the Auburn Seminary based in New York City. I am so grateful and honored to have the opportunity to have my first public discussion, though online, with the newest rabbi at the Isaac Agree Downtown Synagogue in Detroit. And I would like to welcome Rabbi Ariana Silverman to this conversation. Peace.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for extending the invitation to be part of this conversation and for your time this evening. As you heard, I'm Ariana Silverman. I'm the rabbi of the Isaac Agree Downtown Synagogue. I've been living in Detroit for about 10 years and been the rabbi of the synagogue for the past 4 years. And one of the most beautiful pieces of being in Detroit and being at the synagogue is being able to work in partnership with the amazing people and work that's happening in the city and also in Metro Detroit. So I'm glad we get a chance to talk about this this evening because, of course, there are also all of the challenges that our communities are facing both individually and collectively.
Yeah, thank you. And just for the viewing audience to know, and I had reached out to the rabbi actually before the Jewish holy holidays, and but as we say, or we have in the Quran, that you plan, God plans, and God's the best of planners. And I think that right now is a wonderful time for us to have this discussion, in part with other discussions that we plan having with the faith community, given the very tense time that we live in right now. We're about 2 weeks away from the election. Last time I talked to the rabbi, it was before the news story and allegations of a number of individuals who reportedly had a plot to kidnap and execute our governor to try a type of coup d'etat, not somewhere in the global south, but right here south of the border, south of Canada. And with the heightened tensions, we have the insertion of, unfortunately, some xenophobic comments on the campaign trail by one individual who is running for office. I don't even want to dignify him and say his name right now. So this is the time for us to have conversations across racial lines, across faith lines, and especially for leaders, because we have to model the type of behavior and civility that we want to see our country return back to.
Yes, absolutely. I think that one of the greatest tools in oppression is dividing the oppressed, is allowing people who could be allies to feel that they should be fighting with one another, but rather that we are allies. And one of the things that I am privileged that we share is a deep respect and love for across lines of difference rather than animosity. And I am hopeful. I think that, as you said in Yiddish, there's the expression "humans plan and God laughs." That to some extent we don't know what the future holds, and yet we have to be optimistic. I am hopeful that we are headed in a different direction in our country, and I think that you and I will work toward it, and God willing, our people will work toward it. But that we have to keep hopeful.
God willing, God willing. I want to start the conversation off, and I want to mention something to the viewers who are watching, both those who are watching live on Facebook and YouTube, as well as those who will watch this in its entirety, perhaps later on tonight or tomorrow or whenever they get to it. But I was really heartened as one of the imams in the community that after the story broke regarding the issue of immigration customs enforcement and Muslims in their custody, couple of months back, that the story broke that ICE officers basically were giving Muslims the option of either eating pork or have expired, like rotten meals, basically leaving people with no choice but to eat pork. But the bright side of this is that I had some of my Jewish friends and colleagues, including at the Auburn Seminary from New York City and other places, actually who reached out behind the scenes and like the morning that the story broke, is like, Imam, like what can we do to support the Muslims in this time? Or like, oh well, we as Jews, Jewish Americans, we've been through this and we've seen this type of harassment from law enforcement and the weaponizing of pork in particular. So
Mhm.
I just want to lift that up for those who are watching who are Muslims, that and I haven't said this publicly, but we receive calls, emails, and calls of empathy from Jewish American leaders, and particularly bring up the issue of the strange weaponizing of pork. You know, I think there's some people who are bigots who think that, like, I think they think that pork is like kryptonite for Jews and Muslims. I think it's like you put some pork on, so we're gonna like, we're gonna melt. I don't know, like Thanos or something. Like sprinkle, like Salt Man, sprinkle the pork and we're gonna evaporate. I don't know. It's something strange, but I just want to bring that into the conversation.
For sure. I mean, I think um, one, of course, the things about the laws of keeping kosher or halal is that it's a whole set of laws. It's
Yes.
not just pork, people. That there's a whole set of food restrictions, and that it's about living a life of holiness. That the fact that what we eat reflects what we value and who we are is deeply a part of all of our lives, whether we recognize it or not, and whether we treat that as a religious question or not. What we eat, what we choose to put into our bodies, reflects who we are and the relationship that we want to have with the world. And that both of our traditions have recognized that so deeply and created a set of laws that aren't just about restricting, but about sanctifying the act of eating and the relationship that we have with God when we put food into our bodies. And yet, it is very interesting that the one that people seem to pick on the most is the restriction against eating pork. And as you alluded to, historically, that has been the way that a lot of people have tried to torture the Jews, including around issues of forced conversion. That was the thing that was used as a form of torture. And I think it's tragic, and I think that it speaks to, whether people realize it or not, that food is an issue of identity, that food is a piece of who we are and what we believe in our relationship with God, and that part of what is affronting, what is trying to hurt us, is not just trying to break a rule, but trying to suggest that we don't get ownership over the choices that we make about our relationship with God and our relationship with the world.
Most definitely. And actually, you just brought in my mind, because we've had a series of classes that are ongoing every Thursday night, and they're open to the public. We stream them, but it's on the history of racism and resistance in America. And Professor Said Khan, who teaches at Wayne State, he went over Professor Khan.
Mm.
So yeah, he actually touched on this issue as far as colonialism, but he touched on the shared history that we have going back to 1492, because there's two very um, infamous things that took place or started that year. 1492 was the year that Columbus got lost sailing here to the so-called New World, and it's also the year that started the Spanish Inquisition. And we have a timeline actually of the weaponizing, even of pork, against Jewish brothers and sisters as well as Muslims, going back to the Inquisition. So it's a really, I mean, there's a deep history to this weaponizing. But God, God is our protector, and we seek refuge with the Almighty from things. But I also want to touch on something else in relationship to this, and I think you and I also talked about this briefly. But the issue where we had a Jewish Michiganian actually who contacted our office and we're actually working on resolving this case right now, but an issue of the denial of proper meals, and also the basically, well, we have this pork here, you can eat, what's the big deal? But of us dealing with a Jewish American uh, resident of Michigan who was um, he was incarcerated in Macomb County, and
Mhm.
he had a similar situation happen of the denial of kosher. And if you could, just for our audience, I'd like for you to kind of like walk us through this somewhat, because many Muslims, I'm pretty sure, don't understand. I mean, we have a understanding of halal and permissibility, both as far as the what meat is, animals are permissible, how they should be slaughtered, under what conditions, and also the issues of cross contamination and the spiritual effects of even eating unlawful meat, what that could do metaphysically, the connection between the seen and the unseen. But if you could like kind of explain that, like how important is this for someone who is Jewish, um, that they're able to keep kosher, and especially if they're separated from their community and they're behind bars.
So I think um, there. I'm sometimes asked with the kosher laws about why aren't we allowed to eat pork, and people will, historically give some kind of explanation around health reasons or whatever. But the real answer is because God said so. um, and that I think people keep the kosher laws for a whole variety of reasons, and it might not be because God said so, but because my grandmother said so, and that perhaps is even more powerful. But that ultimately it's a question of believing in a set of laws and behaviors that reflect one's identity. And I think that it in jail and in prison is particularly powerful because it's making a statement of having absolutely no autonomy, not just over your body, but over who you are and how you identify in the world. That you don't even get to make the choice about your own religion and how you're going to observe your religion. And that there's all kinds of discrimination that comes even as a subset of that. I had a congregant who was in jail in Wayne County and requested kosher meals and was denied them. And they said instead that he could just eat a vegetarian diet because there's the parallels that if you eat a vegetarian diet, you're not eating meat and you're not cross contaminating with dairy, and therefore there would be no problem, right? Except if you actually wanted to have a diet beyond a vegetarian diet. And then they decided that what they should feed him is lettuce and tomatoes because there's no way those could be problematic, which clearly is not an attempt to um, what's the word I want to follow his religious preferences, but rather to be embarrassing and to humiliate and to also make him very hungry. Um, and
And deficient in protein.
yes, and deficient. I mean, all of the things
Yeah.
that are destructive to the body and to the mind and to the soul. It's an act of oppression. It's not just about religious observance. And I think in his case, part of it too was racism. He's a Jew of color, and they refuse to believe that he's Jewish. So, so in addition to the religious discrimination, there's also the racial discrimination that was occurring in his life in terms of denying his ability to be fully who he is.
Yeah, and also, and I'm curious about this too, because you mentioned Jewish Americans or Jewish people globally of color. Like, what is the breakdown in America? If you know, like the percentage, like Black Jewish people, because I know, like I've met a couple of Ethiopian Jewish people before, but like, what's the breakdown? Like, if you can just give us like some stats of like Jewish people of African or Black background.
So globally, the truth is that lots of Jews are not or don't have white skin. I mean, the or can pass as white. Jews from Ethiopia, Jews from different parts of Africa and Asia. Um, Jews are all over the world and look different, no matter where they come from. And yet, the the normalization of white skin as the standard has permeated into understandings of Jewish people as well. The expectation that if there are Jews with white skin, that that should be considered the norm. Whereas there is a part of me that wonders why we wouldn't just flip the question on its head, and given that Jews are a global people, say what percentage of Jews are white? I mean, I know Jews have all
Yeah.
different colors of skin. Why? What percentage is white? Right? That even the normalizing of white skin is something that shouldn't be happening in the Jewish community, but of course it does because it happens everywhere. But that in the
Thanks
United
for reframing that too, because actually I framed it in that way.
Right? I mean, I think it's
Yeah.
really it's an interesting thing that and we've adapted it too. I mean, and by we I mean the Jewish people, that there's sort of this, well, what percentage are not white? Having said that, that question is also deeply controversial. In the United States, there's an organization called the Jews of Color. Used to be the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative. I think they may have just changed their name, but they did a study 3 years ago to try to determine what percentage of Jews are not white. And interestingly, part of the difficulty of the study is that despite the fact that there are many Jewish population studies in cities and nationally, Jews are very strangely obsessed with counting how many Jews there are, but okay. Despite the number of those surveys, very few of them actually asked a question about race. And I have always spoken about how who counts is often reflected on who we count, right? That just the fact that the question wasn't asked says something really, really tragic about what matters to people when they're thinking about the demographics of the Jewish community. But in any case, they didn't ask. So looking at a meta study of these studies came up with a figure of about 13 to 15% of Jews in the United States are Jews of color. Jews of color, of course, is also tricky to define because since Jews are from all over the world, the question of whiteness and color is a tricky one. But be that as it may, we as a term, Jews of color, 13 to 15%. And of course, as soon as that happened, as soon as that came out, there were shockwaves in the Jewish community because if you go into most synagogues or look at the boards of most major national Jewish organizations, they are not 15% people of color. And so if that is the case, then what does that say about racism within the Jewish community and the way that in which the Jewish community is structured such that it is not representative of Jewish Americans? So then somebody else came out. This is a longer answer than I think you anticipated. Someone else came out with
No, it's fine.
and said, well, it's probably closer to 6%. And once that came up, there was a whole backlash of, well, why are you even trying to minimize the number and to discount this original work? That there was, I think, an intentional denial on the part of much of the Jewish community that this could be the case, because if that's the case, then we're doing something wrong in our institutions because it doesn't reflect that percentage. So it is a very controversial thing in the Jewish community right now. You're very in the moment. I will say I am very proud of the fact that the Downtown Synagogue has a disproportionately large number of Jews of color in our membership and in our leadership, but disproportionate to other synagogues, not disproportionate to the national percentages of Jews of color, but rather to other synagogues. So although I'm proud of the fact that we look different than other synagogues in Metro Detroit, we are not yet where we need to be in terms of being fully diverse and proud of it in the way that we gather and show and have leadership.
Well, I appreciate that in your candor, and I can just tell you that, and we can, it might probably segue us into the next part of discussion, but when George Floyd was tragically killed by officers of the Minneapolis Police Department, there began to be a renewed conversation about race throughout America, but including inside the Muslim community. And there were discussions, a number of discussions in which I talked about and were a part of in relationship to anti-Black racism within inside the Muslim community. Maybe we do a little bit better job than what you were saying, but for instance, in the Muslim community, it's estimated that Black folks make up about 25 to 30% of the community. But even if you look at Muslim national organizations,
Mm.
you don't see Black folks represented in anywhere close to the proportion. If you were to take the five largest American Muslim organizations, CAIR is better than most, but even our organization. And as a matter of fact, I'm like the Obama of CAIR, meaning I'm like the first Black ED of any chapter of CAIR, right? So we've been having these discussions too, in terms of racial equity within inside of Muslim spaces, mosques. Actually, like how do the board of trustees look in mosques in the state of Michigan? Do they actually reflect the people who pray? Um, so marriage is also an issue, right? About interracial marriage
Mhm.
within the Muslim community and how it's frowned upon sometimes in certain segments of the Muslim community. So we've been having those types of difficult conversations too, just to let you know, and we're all a work in progress, trying to, as we tried to hold the political authorities and politicians and police departments accountable, we also have to hold ourselves accountable simultaneously, that we're not being hypocritical and talking about, well, there needs to be less racial profiling by policing, or but we profile each other, or
Mhm.
actively and passively inside our own houses of worship and faith organizations.
And one of the horrifying things that happens in the Jewish community is that people will come to worship in their own synagogue, and because of the color of their skin, other people in that house of worship will assume that they're the help, or they must be the cleaning staff, rather than fellow congregants. And that is horrifying in terms of how people make assumptions about what Jews look like and how we are allowed to treat other people within a sacred place. Um, it is not okay, and it's happening. I think that people are becoming increasingly aware of it as the national conversation, thank God, grows. Um, but it's I don't have to tell you this. It's hard enough being a religious minority in the United States to then be within your religious minority treated as a second class citizen is just shocking. There's no excuse. Um, for that double vulnerability in it, particularly in America at a time when it's not easy being Jewish or Muslim or a person of color, to then have a combination of those within the communities that are supposed to keep us safe.
Yeah, yeah, and it's an issue. I've said before in interviews, somewhat jokingly, but sometimes you have to laugh not to cry. But I've said that, I have a, a, a triple problem. Although I don't see myself as problematic, but it can lead to problems. Is that, I drive while Black, like driving through Grosse Pointe, for instance, or Macomb County. I'll just call them out. I've been harassed driving through Warren and also Grosse Pointe. So I can drive while Black, fly while Muslim. Well,
Mhm.
that's a whole ordeal in and of itself, with so-called random secondary screening at the border, or flying, or things like that. And then also the issue of, in some circumstances, going into certain spaces and not feeling welcome. Though I have a level of privilege because I'm a community leader. So like when I walk into places, people know who I am, right? So it's a little different from myself these days and times. But I have a lot of stories I could tell about certain things that have happened over the years. But I think that when we're talking about some of the issues that are going on right now, we know that there's been a national discourse regarding um, the importance of Black life, and movements and people protesting in the streets, including in Detroit for several days. Our law clerk was at CAIR, Michigan, was down there basically almost every day for a couple of months, down around Corktown and downtown. Um, but I'm curious to see what's going on in the in the Jewish community right now, as far as you know, your attempts and others like yourself about addressing the issue of of racial profiling, uh, police brutality, extrajudicial homicides
Mhm.
by the police all throughout America. And unfortunately, we've had cases like this happen right in our city in Detroit. So, and in Dearborn, it's happened as well, and other places in southeastern Michigan.
So, as we talked about when we were first trying to find a time to have this conversation, we just finished in the Jewish calendar the busiest time when we have the holidays that tend to draw in the most people into their houses of worship, or at least now into their online houses of worship. It's the Christmas and Easter, right, of the Jewish calendar, back to back. And so on Yom Kippur, on the day that we tend to get the most folks, I was going to say in the pews, but in this case on their screens. My sermon was about Black Lives Matter, and I was very nervous about it. I felt very strongly that that needed to be what we talked about. And I said in my sermon that I had a feeling that not a lot of rabbis were talking about this, and I was so happy to be wrong. After these holidays, I found colleague after colleague after colleague in the Jewish community who had spoken about racism, racial profiling, Black Lives Matter in some way in their high holiday sermons, in the sermons in which they have their congregation gathered in the largest numbers. And I was delighted to be wrong, and very proud of the fact that that's not just a conversation that's happening in the synagogue that happens to be located in the city of Detroit, but that it's happening in suburban white America, in Jewish communities all over our country. And having said that, I think one of the things that makes me the most crazy is when people talk about within the Jewish community, should we be getting involved because, is there a natural allyship with them? And my response is, you mean us? That people in my congregation with Black skin, their lives are being threatened. When someone in my congregation feels unsafe, this is not about them. This is about us. That Jews throughout our history are supposed to, if nothing else, be making sure that we can protect the lives of other Jews. And we are talking about the lives of other Jews. And beyond the national conversation, which of course has to happen and of course is very much deeply a part of our moral obligation, that dissonance within the mind of so many that this is about them and not about us is what on some level makes me, it's like I had a professor in rabbinical school who talked about tremble with prophetic rage. It's like, that there is any understanding of this is a question of them, in communities in which we have to be fighting for the lives of the people that we sit next to as we pray. And so I think that part of what is shifting, I hope, is just the understanding of us, of who we're talking about when we talk about the people that we are going to fight for. Because when we understand that it's the people who are in our families and the people who are our neighbors and the people who are our friends and the people who are our colleagues and the people who are our congregants, that it is no longer a question of do we fight for someone else? It's fighting for a greater and deeper understanding of us. Having said that, I fully recognize that there can't be a claiming of the us on the part of white people in terms of the experience of living as a person of color. But I speak more to the idea that that we have to break down the question of who's in our family, because this is not an us and them when people's lives are at risk.
Yeah, indeed. And what you're saying too, and as a faith leader, I'm sure that you tackle this too, like with this, because we all are at different levels on our spiritual journey. Some people won't even ask that question because they say, well, you know what? I need to do the right thing. And that's because that's what God has charged me to do. Right. So it's more about me and fulfilling my covenant with God than
Mhm.
even about those the individuals who could be victims. That's probably the highest level. Then you have those people who would ask the question, and we've had similar discussions like that in the Muslim community. Or unfortunately, we've seen this too, that if the person who's Black, who's Muslim, who is victimized, then perhaps you'd see a larger outcry or more organizing. Oh, brother such and such was shot and killed by the police, or uh, like Stefan Clark, for instance, who's an African American Muslim who was killed a little over almost 2 years ago in Sacramento area, for instance. There was a lot around that. Or if we go back to the late 90s with Amadou Diallo, who was brutally murdered by the NYPD, then there's mobilization and people want to do things. But sometimes some people are like, well, oh, well, it's a shame, but but what does that have to do with us? Or they ask the question, was the person a Muslim? So
Wow.
that's at a different level. And we have people like that, right? And then there are other people who are like, you have to bring it around a little more, where you have to say, well, you know, um, do you know how such and such government abuses and treats your family members, or how they treated you or your parents before you immigrated here? Well, those how the mukhabarat, or how those police abuse people back over there, this is what the police are doing to Black folks here. So then sometimes you have to go stretch all across the world, like to Nigeria. It's like there's like the anti-SARS movement going on right now, because police brutality is a real effort to protest against the special forces, or the special police unit in Nigeria, right? So sometimes you have to connect the dots to say, oh, well, this is taking place over there, and therefore to make the parallel. So it's a level sometimes of trying to reach out to people where they're at. And I think that the challenge for us is, how can we as faith leaders in this very crucial time in American history, how can we get people who are not in so-called minority groups, who are part of the dominant culture, to actually uh, care about children being put in cages at the southern border, who are little brown babies or little brown children? Or how do we care about or center uh, Native Americans or the indigenous people who suffer mass incarceration at a higher rate percentage than any other demographic in America, and also are subject to police brutality? Or the Hakeem Littleton, who gets shot and killed under shady circumstances by the Detroit police. Like how do we get people to actually get more engaged in this? I think that's the big question that we have facing us right now.
Um, I think that we live in a world in which we have been intentionally segregated, that that governments and city planners and people in power have put highways and homes and economic barriers so that you don't live with people who look or worship or um, earn the same as you do, or even vote the same, and that therefore you have an easier time distancing yourself, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually and psychologically. And that one of the most powerful ways that people um, show up for other people is when they're in relationship with other people, right? It's the proximity question. And talk about Stevenson, right? The question of proximity. And then I think one of the things that we need to do is break down those barriers and figure out how to get people more proximate. It's a little awkward in times of social distancing, but I
Right.
think we're doing it literally right now. That we need to be able to see and interact and talk with people across lines of faith and race and class. Because until we do, it's going to be much harder to mobilize and motivate people to work for the good of folks. And I saw that a lot actually in the whole marriage equality fight, that as a faith leader who was deeply committed to marriage equality, that I would go out there and I would talk till I was blue in the face about Leviticus and why this is being misinterpreted and that's being misinterpreted, and how I believe God shows up for people in the LGBTQ community. And ultimately, what drove the change in the marriage equality fight was people having LGBTQ people in their families who came out, or in their office places that came out, or in their neighborhood clubs that came out. That once they realized that we are actually in relationship with people who are different, then we start to show up for them in a different way. And so I think I would love to believe that I could just make a message from the pulpit, right? I could just give the moral argument and explain it. But that ultimately people tend to get out of bed from the heart rather than the head. And how do we create the relationships that allow us to get up in the morning and want to fight for someone we love? And that's really hard to do when we have been placed in situations that keep us apart.
Yeah, I agree with you as far as it's number one, it's really hard right now because of COVID-19. And it's true, especially in this area, that Detroit has been historically one of the most segregated areas in America, where we have invisible walls that separate communities. Just going on the west side of Detroit down Tireman, how one side is Dearborn and one side is Detroit, and people don't even walk on the other side of the sidewalk, much less talk to people across the street, their neighbors.
Mm.
That's a reality in our area, and as you said, this is by design. The hyper segregation in this area in particular is by design. And then then we can talk about the intentional scuttling of mass transportation to make it even easier of keeping people segregated. I think that has a part to do with it. I've been pondering this for quite a while, as far as the effects of words and language that dehumanizes people. Because when I think about also the issue of proximity, see, as on both sides of my family, my family comes from the South, and they're both descendants of enslaved African people who were brought here. And I think about the slave masters lived in extremely close proximity to the enslaved. They lived on the same plantations. The enslaved Black people would be in the houses of the white people, nursing their children, cooking their food, um, playing the fiddle, um, and yet there was still a system that was set up that those white people and those who did business in the plantation could deal with Black people every day and regularly, and still see Black people as subhuman. So I just been I just mentioned that, and it's not trying to refute anything you're saying, but I've been doing a lot of thinking about this lately, especially in terms of race relations. Um, Even how some of these cops can have Black partners, and they can exceptionalize. I call this the Obama effect. They can exceptionalize their Black partner. I mean, their Black, not partner in life, but they're on the
Right,
beat.
right.
Um, Or another example, like how the park lady who was uh, a self-proclaimed progressive in
Right,
New York
right,
City, who donated to Senator Hillary Clinton's campaign when she was running for president, voted for Obama twice, and donated to his campaign. And then she picks up the phone and threatens, I mean, to call the police on the Black bird watcher, knowing that it could get him killed.
killed.
Right. And so, like, it's I don't have all the answers. I'm just throwing this out, because we're part of a discussion. But um how do we adjust our language where people can otherize, or they can exceptionalize? See, this is the good Black person.
Mhm.
This is the good Muslim. This is the good Jewish person. Then at the same time, um, don't show that same level of respect or deference to the swath or vast majority of those people that they have exceptionalized. mean, if you understand what I'm saying, that those
Yeah.
individuals are exceptionalized.
So what do you think?
I don't know. I don't have to figure it out. That's why I'm trying to to get some answers from you. I'm not sure, except for um, I think that people who hold these comments, or I mean, hold these views,
Mhm.
they voice them at certain times in the safety of their own company of people who look like them in their identity group. So I've been thinking about this a while about the need for interrupters,
Mm,
right, inside one's faith community. So if someone is saying or making anti-Jewish statements, let's say in the Muslim community, there has to be someone or people who are Muslim interrupters. If there's white folks who just hold anti-Arab animus or
mhm,
anti-black animus, and of course there are black Arabs. So that's a whole different discussion. But there are a lot of black Arabs. That there has to be white folks who are white interrupters against the anti-black racism among white people.
mm.
Um, so there's just some of my thoughts.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
How do
But
we go ahead.
no, there are no easy answers. If we just had a playbook and worked the playbook, then I guess the problems we wouldn't be in the state that we are in right now in 2020 in America if there was an easy playbook.
Yeah. I think it's both, right? It's the will and the mechanisms that we need to inculcate. Um, People need to want it, and people need to know how to do it. Um, and I think you're absolutely right about the interrupters. How do we train the interrupters, particularly as clergy?
Well, I think firstly it's an embodiment of the actual clergy,
Mhm,
and then there's the actual spiritual teachings that are taught and that are embodied in the individual, in which there's like a spiritual transference of the state of the teachers to those who they're around, and it's done with repetition. Because I've always said that we see physical manifestations of racism, but those are just symptoms of spiritual diseases, right?
mm,
So when I look at the issue of racism, I look at certain spiritual diseases that have to be treated and dealt with. And that in of itself, if those are tackled, then the intellectual arguments or the intellectual proofs are much easier because we're talking about racism from the Islam perspective. The primary uh, spiritual disease or disease of the heart that undergirds racism is arrogance.
mhm,
All right. Then you also have the issue of envy. Uh, and our definition of envy is not just wanting what someone else has, but you want what they have and you want to be stripped from the other person. Right. Like you don't think they're deserving to have it and you should have it. That's how
mhm,
we define envy. Then there's also the issue of of ignorance, and there's simple ignorance of people who say they don't know, but they can admit they don't know. And then we have the term what's called complex or compounded ignorance, when someone doesn't know, but they think they know. And when you try to give them other information, they double down and dig their heels in their ignorance, right? So there's the level of the issues of the heart work and then the information. So as one of my mentors, Dr. Sherman Jackson, he teaches at University of Southern California. He used to live in Ann Arbor. He said that heart work is the hardest work.
mm,
Heart work is the hard work. It's the hardest work.
mm.
But that's just my take. What do you think?
Oh, I mean, I think you're right in many ways. And I mean, I hope that that we have the opportunity to really be heard, that that we can do that work, and that people will hear it.
Mm.
Um, because I think the question of envy that you articulated so well is based on an assumption of scarcity, right? There's not enough for everybody, and so either you have it or I have it. As opposed to abundance, that there's more than enough for everyone, and so you can have some and I can have some. Um, and that there's no question that people are living with tremendous scarcity, but that doesn't mean that it has to be that way. Um, and that's part of a religious question too, is how do we restructure a world of abundance? Um, because certainly the message that we get from people in power is that there's not enough for everyone, and therefore only certain people should get it. Rather than, if we actually wanted everyone to have what they need and to be treated with dignity, that we could figure out how to do that. Right. So there's even undergirding the envy piece is the assumption that that there's not enough.
Yeah, you're right. Which then plays into another other spiritual maladies such as greed and stinginess
Right.
that play parts. But you're right. There definitely is enough to go around, and and there's always been a issue in America of of the intersection of race and class, and I would say racism and pure capitalism. I think there's always, and we obviously have historical um, documentation about how this was used in the Reconstruction era against poor whites, and it seems that the same playbook that was done in the mid late 1800s, I guess it's still working kind of like in a diabolical way, but there's definitely this. We have a lot of work to do.
We have a lot of work to do.
A lot of work to do. Well, do you have any closing comments? 'Cause I said that, we keep the conversation within 45 minutes to an hour. So we've gone over the 45-minute
But we
realm.
have so much abundance. We have abundance. We don't have to be focused on limits. Yeah. Um, I hear deeply, and I appreciate you being my teacher in terms of the question of proximity not being enough. That you're absolutely right. That people have been very proximate and yet held incredibly deep racist views. Um, and I'm hoping that um, that proximity changes. That that when we are in close relationship with human beings, we figure out how to make that a relationship of love, um, and not envy, as you're saying, and not the arrogance um, and I mean this very sincerely, that I hope that part of what can happen is um, a continuance of that conversation, not just among us, but among people in our communities. I often get the critique, and I think it's deeply true, that clergy are supposed to lead by example, and sometimes do a good job of talking to clergy across lines of race and faith and class, but then their members don't. And
Yes.
so what does it mean for us to commit not just to having a conversation with one another as clergy leaders, but figuring out what it means for um, the people we serve to be empowered to do so as well. And I'll think about that and welcome your teaching as well. Of certainly we have the responsibility to lead by example, and we also have a responsibility to figure out how to empower folks um, in a time when it's so difficult to do. And, people don't like having hard conversations, or at least they think they don't. But
Yeah, well, we definitely need more courageous conversations and to bring people along um, with a level of grace and compassion. If people are at different areas, but we definitely can pick up a continuous conversation more. I think as we talk about issues of racial justice and inclusion in our country, and especially in southeastern Michigan, I would be willing. I think we should talk about this more and maybe bring in a couple other people. But I think that a sacred teaching would
mm,
be fantastic of how we could bring together congregants and uh, younger people in particular. But it doesn't have to be. It should be intergenerational, but to have a sacred teaching about the sacredness of the human beings, of the human soul, to deal with the the virtuous traits of character that we should be striving to embody, that we could live as all together as children of Adam, and how we can, you know, try to come up with a different narrative. Like I think words matter, like another narrative that we can embrace, that we can just, be truly human and to, try to interrupt the state of hatred and polarization that we have, where even family members who are in different sides of parties aren't even talking with each other right now. Like I've heard those stories where brothers and sisters aren't talking because one supports the elephants and the other supports the donkeys, and it's uh so I'd like to explore that. I think it could be something that could be really be uh, powerful.
yeah, yeah. All right. I want to end on a message of hope.
Wonderful. Please, and us off with the message of
I
hope.
I think it's real. I don't think it's naive. I think the audacity of hope is a real thing. Um, and I think that part of hope is believing we can get there, and part of hope is working toward it. But that we all have the opportunity in the days and weeks to come to actually believe in a different future, and to write it. That the future has not yet been written, and we can. And I hope people get their acts together.
Well, we have to do prayer and action, as
Yeah.
you said. That the one teacher I used to study under, he said that wishing is the capital of penniless people. So we hope, and hope includes
And
work
work.
but with God's permission, we can we can see and live the change that we're striving for, and that's where the hope is. So
Say,
thank you very much for your generosity of your time in this conversation. And I think that as you were saying that I was being your teacher, you were being my teacher as well in this moment. And um, may the Almighty, guide us all to that what is best, and fill our hearts with light and love and empathy. And may the creator of the heavens and the earth, the one who's the source of peace, spread peace in our land at this time, and spread peace throughout the world. And we ask this in God's holy name.
amen.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll stay in contact. And for all of those of you who are watching, please share this conversation, this link, with someone that you know. Not that even you agree with everything that you've heard, but that you share it. 'Cause I think that we need to start listening to each other and listening to some different voices, and not be in our own ethnic or religious silos. So please share this link. And with that, we conclude. Assalamu alaikum. Peace.